In our last video, we talked about genetic disorders. We gave an overview of what genetic disorders are and classified genetic disorders into single gene disorders, complex multigenic disorders, and chromosomal disorders. In this video, we are going to focus on dominant and recessive disorders and then touch a little on chromosomal disorders. Okay? And remember that we said that dominant disorders can either be X-linked or autosomal, and also recessive disorders can either be X-linked or autosomal. We will begin with autosomal disorders, and of course autosomal disorders will be either autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive disorders. Okay, but before we begin, I would like to tell us a few things, a few terms that will be coming in the course of this discussion. Number one, allele. Okay, an allele is a variant. Okay, it's a variant of a gene. And usually, every individual inherits one variant from each parent. Okay, that makes it a pair of genes. Okay, so each of these variants is called an allele. And if the person inherits two identical variants, if he inherits two identical variants, let's use T to denote for variants. Capital letter T for two dominant variants. If the person inherits two identical variants, we say that that person is homozygous. Is homozygous for the gene. But if he inherits two different variants, we'll say that the person is heterozygous. Heterozygous for that gene. Okay? Another thing I would like us to know is that sometimes we use the word hemizygous. Hemizygous. You may see this word, and it simply means that this person has inherited two separate chromosomes, okay, as a pair. And usually hemizygous is used for male because they inherit X and Y, which are two separate chromosomes that make up their pair of sex chromosomes. Okay, so these are some terms that we need to know. In the course of our discussion, other terms will come around. Okay, so autosomal dominant diseases are diseases that manifest in the heterozygous state, and so we are going to be using capital letter T to denote dominant genes, and then small letter t to denote recessive genes. And so when we talk about autosomal dominant, we are saying that these diseases are diseases that manifest in the heterozygous state. So this person inherits one dominant gene and one recessive gene, and this is enough for the disease to manifest. Okay, it means therefore that only one parent needs to have the disease for the offspring to get the disease. Okay, so let us say, for example, that this is the defective gene, this dominant gene is the defective gene, and then we are going to draw a transmission chart, sort of. Okay, so this parent has this pair of genes, and this is the defective gene, while this parent has this is homozygous, okay, for the genes. Of course, this parent donates this donates this, okay, and that gives us this and this. Okay, this parent donates this parent donates this and gives us this. chart follows the Mendelian laws, okay? The law of independent assortment, meaning that inheritance of each of these genes is independent of the other. And then, of course, the law of segregation, okay, showing that each parent will donate one allele to his offspring. At the end of the day, you discover that every child has a 50% chance of coming down with the disease in autosomal dominant disorders. Okay, so there's a 50% chance. From this chart, we will gather some characteristics of autosomal dominant diseases. The first is one parent is needed. Okay, one parent is enough to transmit the disease. One parent is enough to transmit the disease if the parent is a carrier. Number two is that the disease manifests in the heterozygous state. And number three is that every child or every offspring has a 50% chance of coming down with the disease. Okay? Now, other characteristics of autosomal disorders is that they have what we call incomplete penetrance. Incomplete penetrance. Okay? What incomplete penetrance simply means is that the number of people that have the defective genes, not everybody that has the defective genes will manifest the disease, and that is incomplete penetrance. So that some people who have defective genes will not manifest the disease. Okay, that is one characteristic of autosomal dominant disorders. Another characteristic of autosomal dominant disorders is that they have what we call variable expressivity. Variable expressivity. Okay. What variable expressivity is that those that manifest the disease actually have different clinical features. Some have severe clinical features, some have very mild clinical features. Okay, the clinical features vary. That is what variable expressivity is. It simply means that the expression of the disease varies among the population. Okay, so one example of an autosomal dominant disease is neurofibromatosis. Some people will come down with neurofibromas all over their bodies. They'll come down with hearing defects and all of that, while some others will just have only cafe au lait spots. Okay, so the disease manifests differently in the environment. And then finally, concerning the pathogenesis of autosomal dominant disorders, they are usually associated with defects in structural proteins. In structural proteins. Okay, so you see that most of the autosomal dominant diseases have problems with structural proteins or proteins that play a very, very key role in metabolic processes. Okay, and so we'll have examples of autosomal dominant diseases related to structural proteins. Okay, like Marfan's syndrome, like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Okay, things like Huntington's disease. We have familial polypocycoli. We have von Willebrand's disease. We have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Okay, these are examples. Familial hypercholesterolemia. These are examples of autosomal dominant disease. Another characteristic of autosomal dominant diseases is that these diseases manifest later. They manifest later in life. They do not manifest early in life. So they manifest maybe in adolescent or early adulthood. Okay, those are some of the characteristics of autosomal disorders. The next thing we'll be talking about is autosomal recessive disorders. So, autosomal recessive disorders are more like conditions where the recessive genes attempt to show themselves, genes that have been hidden, okay, want to show themselves. Okay, so what happens in autosomal recessive disorders is that the disease manifests in the homozygous state, meaning that two of the defective alleles must be inherited for the disease to manifest. And that tells us that each parent will contribute, so both parents will have to be carriers for the disease to manifest. Okay, remember that our little letter, our small letter, is what denotes recessive. Okay, so let us draw that transmission chart. Now we have this, the recessive is the defective gene from one of the parent, and this is also from another of the parent. This is where the defective gene is. Okay, again we'll use the Mendel's law. Okay, so like I said, that the disease manifests in the homozygous state, and so this is where the disease is. It manifests in the homozygous state, and it makes a lot of sense because the dominant gene will mask the expression of the recessive gene. But where there is no dominant gene, both recessive genes will express themselves. Okay, so from this chart, we are going to now list out some characteristics of autosomal recessive disorders. The first we see is that both parents must be carriers, okay, for the disease to manifest in the offspring. So both parents contribute to the disease. Okay, the second is that the disease manifests in the homozygous state. Homozygous state. Okay, and then the third is that there is a 25% chance, okay, 1 in 4. There is a 25% chance for each of the offspring to come down with the disease. There is a 25% chance for each of the offspring to come down with the disease. Okay, some other characteristics of autosomal recessive disorders is that there is usually complete penetrance. Complete penetrance. And that simply means that everybody that has the defective gene will manifest the disease. Okay, so there's complete penetrance. As long as you have that defective gene, you will manifest the disease. Another characteristic of autosomal recessive disorders is that there is uniform expressivity. Uniform expressivity. Okay, so that anyone that has the disease will manifest or will have similar clinical features. Okay, so among the population, people who have autosomal recessive diseases, a particular autosomal recessive disease will have the same or similar clinical features. That is what is called uniform expressivity. One classical example of an autosomal recessive disease is sickle cell anemia. Okay, and that is why we have such a thing as sickle cell habitus, because everyone that has sickle cell anemia can come down with those changes. Okay, anemia and all of that. Okay, so there is uniform expressivity. One other characteristic of autosomal recessive disorders is that they manifest early. They manifest early in life. Okay, they manifest early in life. And then finally, their pathogenesis are usually related to enzymes, mainly enzymes and other minor proteins. Okay, mainly enzymes and other minor proteins. And that is why the examples of autosomal recessive disorders are abundant. Okay, and all inborn errors of metabolism are autosomal recessive disorders. Okay, so the glycogen storage diseases, alkaptonuria, phenylketonuria, okay, homocystinuria, they are all autosomal recessive disorders. Others include some variants of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, okay, infant polycystic kidney diseases, autosomal recessive disorders, sickle cell anemia, okay, the thalassemias, they are all autosomal recessive disorders. These are examples of autosomal recessive disorders, and of course these are the different characteristics of autosomal recessive disorders. Having talked about autosomal recessive disorders, let us quickly talk about X-linked recessive disorders. Yeah, so about X-linked recessive disorders, there are certain things I would like us to know or to remember about the sex chromosomes. Okay, remember that males have X, Y, and females have X, X. Now, the Y chromosome and the X chromosome have nothing in common. And so when there is a defect in the X chromosome, it will definitely manifest in the male. Okay? So when there's a defect in the X chromosome, it will definitely manifest in the male. And of course, this makes males to be hemizygous. Hemizygous. Okay? For X chromosomes. Now, sometimes there may be a defect in one of the X chromosomes, but of course, apart from the fact that they are complementary, there's also what is called lionization, where there is an inactivation of a large part of one of the X chromosomes. Okay, so X-linked disorders will usually manifest in the males. Okay, so they manifest mainly in the males. That is one thing about X-linked recessive disorders. Of course, X-linked dominant disorders can also manifest in the females. Okay, but X-linked recessive disorders will manifest in the males. And then secondly, because males do not transmit the X chromosome or do not give up their X chromosome to their sons, they will not transmit the disease. They will not transmit the defect. Okay, so this disease is usually transmitted from mothers, okay, to their sons, okay, and of course it can be transmitted from fathers, of course, to their daughters. The defective gene can be transmitted from fathers to their daughters. Okay, so these are some basic things that we need to know about X-linked recessive disorders. Okay, so fathers do not transmit the disease to their sons, but it is transmitted from mothers to their sons, and that is because it is on the X chromosome. Now, the Y chromosome doesn't really have a lot of genetic defects, because most of the gene on the Y chromosomes are associated with sex determination. Okay, sex determination. All right. So, what are the examples of X-linked recessive disorders? Examples include hemophilia A and B. Okay, hemophilia A and B. Chronic granulomatous disease, some variants of chronic granulomatous disease. Okay, it also includes Lesch-Nyhan syndrome. Okay, and these are some of the X-linked recessive diseases. Okay, examples of X-linked dominant diseases. X-linked dominant diseases. X-linked dominant diseases are Alport's syndrome. Alport syndrome. Okay, so those are the things we should know about X-linked disorders. Now we'll briefly talk about chromosomal disorders. We had already talked about them in detail in the last video, where we classified chromosomal disorders into structural and numerical. But I think that there are just some examples of chromosomal disorders that need to be mentioned, particularly the sex chromosomal disorders. Okay, I will just mention them and we will come to a close. Okay, so there is X0, okay, where the individual gets just one sex chromosome and doesn't inherit the other, what we call a Turner's syndrome. Turner's syndrome. Okay? Turner's syndrome. And then there is XXY, what we call the Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome. And then there is XXX, what we call the superwoman syndrome. Superwoman syndrome. Okay? So that is just that about genetic diseases, a summary of genetic diseases. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd like you to like, subscribe, share. Okay? Thank you so much for watching.